My name is Dolores. Standing in the middle of this once celebratory room, now filled with stunned silence, I can't help but think back on how I got here. The air is thick with the weight of truth, and the faces around me are a mix of shock and realization. Just moments ago, my parents were beaming with pride as they celebrated my brother, Leo's, debt-free entry into the medical field. The room was filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft glow of candles. But then, everything changed. It all started the morning before this grand event. I was at my parents' house in a peaceful New York suburb, still wearing the clothes from my overnight shift at the local hospital. My mother, a woman always more concerned with appearances than feelings, slid a folded note across the counter without even looking at me. I had hoped it was a sign that they finally recognized my hard work, but instead, it was 2 single-dollar bills and a note from my father, a man of few words but many prejudices. It read, "Figure it out yourself. It'll make you stronger." Leo and I had graduated from medical school together. We had the same degree, the same family name, but our paths couldn't have been more different. While Leo was getting a future handed to him on a silver platter, with his loans paid off and a big party to celebrate, I was being treated like my struggles were a gift I should be grateful for. When I asked my parents why this was fair, I got the same old answer. He needs more help. You're the strong one. You'll be fine. It was a narrative that had followed me my entire life. As a child, I was the quiet one. I loved books, structure, and asking questions that didn't make for exciting dinner conversations. Leo, on the other hand, was the life of the party. He had a magnetic personality, made friends easily, and always seemed to be in the spotlight. When we were in school, the difference in our treatment was glaring. If Leo scored a goal in a game, my parents would take pictures, post them online, and take us all out for a fancy dinner. But when I won a science competition, they would simply tell me they were proud and ask me to warm up leftovers when I got home. As we grew older, the gap between us only widened. When Leo turned 18, he got a brand new car with a giant bow in the driveway. 3 months later, when it was my turn, I got a planner and a lecture about being practical. My mother said I was mature enough to understand that not every gift had to be flashy, and my father said I was lucky because character mattered more than luxuries. But in reality, it was just unequal treatment dressed up in fancy words. When we both decided to go into medicine, my parents' bias became even more apparent. They said Leo had the people skills to become a doctor everyone loved, while I had the discipline to survive hard things without much help. They were building an entire philosophy around why it was reasonable to favor him over me. In college, the difference between us became impossible to ignore. Leo would call our parents whenever he was stressed about a class, and they would immediately send him a tutor, extra money, or come to visit him. But when I called, I would just get advice. I worked part-time at a coffee shop before my morning labs and picked up extra shifts on weekends to cover my rent and books. I learned to stretch every dollar and make the most of what I had. When it came to the MCAT, Leo needed an expensive prep course, and my parents didn't hesitate to pay for it. They called it an investment in his future. But when I scored high on my first try using used books, library materials, and online practice exams, my father just nodded and said, "That sounds like you." It was never congratulations, never the same level of excitement they had for Leo. By the time we got into medical school, I was already drowning in debt. Leo, on the other hand, had a much lighter load because my parents had paid for most of his expenses. But I was determined to prove myself. I worked harder than ever, staying up late to study, taking detailed notes, and volunteering for extra clinical hours. Despite the odds, I managed to stay near the top of my class. But every so often, something would happen to remind me of the unfairness of it all. My parents would fly in for one of Leo's white coat ceremonies and take pictures like he was the first person in our family to become a doctor. They would miss my research presentations because they said the drive was too far. But then, I met Dr. Amelia Grant. She was a brilliant surgeon who didn't care about charm or popularity. She cared about precision, judgment, and hard work. The first time I worked with her, she asked me 3 difficult questions about a patient case and waited patiently for me to think through my answers. When I was done, she gave me a small nod and said, "Good. You're actually thinking, not just performing." That one sentence meant the world to me. It was the first time in a long time that someone had recognized my efforts. I started spending more time in the clinical innovation lab she supervised, helping with a research project on improving emergency response outcomes in high-risk trauma cases. Dr. Grant saw something in me that no one else had. She trusted me with important responsibilities and challenged me to think outside the box. She also saw the dynamic in my family. One day, after my parents had attended a department event and talked about how independent I was, Dr. Grant asked me, "Has your family always mistaken neglect for confidence in you?" I laughed nervously, not knowing how to respond. But then I said, "Yes." That was the moment I stopped pretending that everything was okay. Over the next few months, I became one of Dr. Grant's primary research fellows. She pushed me harder than anyone ever had, but it was in a good way. She taught me to stand up for myself, to defend my conclusions, and to stop apologizing for being competent. Meanwhile, Leo was still moving through the system with the support of my parents. He made connections easily, impressed people in interviews, and looked like the perfect future doctor. My parents were already talking about the kind of leader he could become, the kind who would chair committees and charm donors. But beneath his confident exterior, I could see that he was struggling. He had become so dependent on my parents' approval that he didn't know how to function without it. Near the end of that year, after a particularly difficult shift, Dr. Grant asked me to stay behind. She closed the door to her office, handed me a bottle of water, and said, "There are a few programs and awards that don't care whose child you are or who paid your bills. They only care about your work. I want your name in front of them." That conversation was the turning point in my life. A few days later, I got a message from Dr. Grant asking me to come to her office before noon. I drove there with the $2 still in my bag and the note from my father folded in half, hoping that somehow it would all make sense. When I arrived, her assistant smiled and said, "Congratulations." I thought she had made a mistake, but then Dr. Grant walked in with a folder in her hand. She told me that I had been selected for the National Clinical Innovation Award and that the Hospital Foundation had approved a major loan repayment grant tied to my trauma systems research. On top of that, the residency track I had ranked first had made me an early leadership offer. I was in shock. It was like years of locked doors had finally opened all at once. My work had finally been recognized, not just privately, but publicly and formally. But then, Dr. Grant dropped another bombshell. She told me that I was invited to the celebration for Leo that night, and that my parents had sent out department invitations to make an impression on important people. She said that if they used the event to present a false version of what had happened, she was not willing to sit back and let it happen. I was torn. Part of me wanted to expose the truth, to finally make my parents see what they had done. But another part of me still wanted to protect them, to not ruin Leo's big night. As I was leaving Dr. Grant's office, my phone buzzed. It was Leo. He wrote, "I know tonight is weird. Just please don't make it tense. Mom is already emotional and Dad wants this to go smoothly." I read the message twice, and it confirmed what I had always suspected. He knew that the night was built on a lie, but his first instinct was to protect the event, not me. I sat in my car for a long time, looking out at the people passing by. I realized that my life had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. When I finally arrived at the celebration, it was everything I expected. The room was filled with people, the tables were beautifully decorated, and there was a slideshow playing on the wall with pictures of Leo. My mother greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and immediately asked me to speak to one of the servers about the vegetarian place cards. It was the same old pattern. She didn't even ask how I was or if I had any good news. My father was introducing Leo to two department leaders, his hand on Leo's shoulder, looking like he had single-handedly created his son's future. Dr. Grant arrived a little later, looking elegant and composed. My father rushed over to greet her, but I could see the moment he realized that she was not there to play along with his story. Dinner was called, and the seating chart said it all. Leo was at the head table with my parents, two department chairs, a hospital donor, and Dr. Grant. I was placed at a side table with extended relatives and family friends. It was a clear message of hierarchy, but everyone pretended not to notice. After the first course, my father stood up to give a speech. He talked about sacrifice, family, and pride, and how proud he was to see Leo step into medicine unburdened by debt. He said, "We always knew which of our children needed a stronger foundation, and tonight we are proud to say we gave him one." A few people clapped, but I could feel the tension in the room. My mother took over next and described Leo as the child who carried the family's future, the one who brought people together. She then added that not every child needs the same kind of investment, and that some are simply built to make it on their own. Just as the applause was dying down, Leo stood up. He looked uncomfortable, like he was trapped. He thanked everyone for coming and then said, "There is something about tonight that doesn't feel right to me." Dolores and I crossed the same finish line. She worked just as hard as I did, if not harder. There were murmurs in the room, and my mother whispered his name under her breath, warning him to stop. But Leo kept going. He said, "I didn't earn this debt-free status the way everyone here is being led to believe. My parents paid for it." The room went completely silent. My mother's face turned pale, and my father tried to laugh it off, but it was clear that the air had changed. Then, Dr. Grant stood up. She didn't raise her glass or ask for permission. She simply spoke in a calm, steady voice. Since honesty seems to have entered the room, perhaps this is the appropriate moment to share a fuller picture of the family's achievements this year. Dolores has just been awarded the National Clinical Innovation Award for her work on trauma response systems. The board has also approved a major loan repayment grant tied to her research, which means her debt will be cleared by merit, not by parental preference. She has also received an early leadership offer from the residency program she ranked first. And several aspects of the clinical innovation project now being discussed across the department were developed from her analysis and fieldwork. The room was in shock. People started to turn towards me, their eyes wide with surprise. One of the department chairs stood up, followed by another. A donor at the head table leaned towards Dr. Grant and asked a question about my project. My father tried to recover, saying that of course they were proud of me, but it was too late. The damage had been done. My mother tried to re-enter the conversation, saying that every child has different needs, but her words fell flat. Dr. Grant then turned to my parents and said, "There is a difference between believing a child is capable and deciding that her silence makes her easier to overlook." The fallout was immediate. People started to leave their seats and come towards me, congratulating me and asking about my future. My brother found me a few minutes later near the windows overlooking the harbor. He looked tired and defeated. He said, "I'm sorry." And for the first time, I believed him. He then said something I had waited years to hear. They didn't support me more because I was better. They supported me more because it made them feel good to be needed. And I let them. I looked at him for a long time and said, "Yes, you did." Over the next few days, the change in my parents' social circle was obvious. Colleagues who used to respond to my mother's messages right away took longer. My father stopped getting the same eager tone from people he had once charmed easily. My brother and I started to rebuild our relationship. He began to make choices without relying on our parents' approval. He was still learning, but he was trying. My parents tried to make amends, coming to my apartment with gifts. But I couldn't accept their false apologies. I told them that I needed distance, that calling me strong did not give them permission to abandon me. 3 months later, I moved for my residency. It was a new beginning, a chance to build a life on my own terms. I was still working long hours, still tired, but the exhaustion was different. It was attached to purpose, to a future that I had earned. Looking back, I realized that the most important lesson I learned was that strength should be nurtured, not exploited. Independence should be respected, not punished. And no family should call itself loving while only investing in the child who reflects back the image it prefers. I hope that my story can inspire others who have been in similar situations. Your ability to survive without help does not mean you deserve less of it. And sometimes, the most important education life gives us is learning that our value does not shrink just because the wrong people failed to recognize it.